Hello and welcome to Dig Deeper in Holy Week. We are covering quite a lot in a small space of time, and it's great to have my friend Stephen Backhouse, who's been journeying with us since September throughout the whole of Mark's Gospel. And here we are in Holy Week, coming to a crescendo with all that's happening. And for the sake of time, we're not going to read the passage as we would normally do, but we are looking at Mark chapter 14, which at St. Luke's we are covering on Maundy Thursday. And then we're going to be looking at chapters 15 and 16 that we'll be covering at Good Friday and on Easter Day, so that we end on the crescendo of the resurrection with the end of Mark's Gospel, bringing our time together in Mark to a close. We're not going to read it out verse by verse. It's a long old chapter.
It's a really long chapter, this one.
Long chapter. But these are the things that we will be looking to speak about. The first thing that happens in chapter 14 is Jesus is anointed by all the perfume that this woman anoints Jesus's head with. And then the Last Supper happens. Then we had Gethsemane and his struggles in Gethsemane, Jesus's arrest, Jesus before the Sanhedrin, and then the famous passage, of course, where Peter disowns and denies Jesus.
Yeah.
So a lot in chapter 14, a lot that happens on that night before the cross. And I have to say, Stephen, this is probably liturgically one of my favorite evenings in the Christian year.
Okay. See, I haven't been kind of trained up as a priest in any of those ways. So tell me about that. What happens in this part of the Christian year?
Well, traditionally, we have a service on Maundy Thursday. That's what it's called. And it's the final time that we would take communion before Easter Day.
Yeah.
And that's to mirror the Last Supper. It's not in this passage, of course. It's in John's Gospel, where the foot washing is as well. But the journey of those last 24 hours, really, before Jesus is executed, is for me incredibly moving. And so for us, the way that we reflect that in the service is that we will have very simple said service. We would have maybe 2 or 3 hymns that we'd sing. Of course, this year we're not able to, but normally we would sing them. And the way the readings are done is that we take sections of usually Matthew's Gospel, actually, and we read out section by section the events of the night before Jesus' death. And then the bit that I find the most moving of all is that we end with the passage in Matthew's Gospel where he's before the Sanhedrin, and I think the final words are something, and he was sentenced to death. That's the final phrase, at which point everybody leaves in their own time, but leaves in silence. There's no final blessing, there's nothing. We just have that, and he was sentenced to death, and then leave. And there's a cross in the middle, an empty cross in the middle of the floor. We gather in a circle, and in previous years we've done foot washing as well. I just the combination and the multi-sensory element of what you're hearing, what you're seeing, what you're feeling, I think gets me to a point where I understand Good Friday and the events of Good Friday in a much more prepared way.
Right. Yeah.
So here we are, chapter 14 of Mark.
Cool. So, I mean, well, as you already pointed out, it really slows down. Like you'll notice that Mark, which is notoriously very quick, snappy, and you remember his favorite word is immediately.
Mm-hmm.
That word doesn't show up very much in these last chapters because all time slows down, and he, whereas before in previous chapters he just jumping really quickly from scene to scene and whole like geographical locations that would normally take days to traverse, he just skips from one to the next
right
in the sentence. And now all of a sudden time slows down and he goes into great detail of describing, hours in a day rather than whole
Yeah.
days. And yeah, you can tell that Mark 14, 15, and 16 is the most important part of Mark. That's
what's interesting in I've just been doing a flick through that in my version, which I'm using David Bentley Hart's version today. It gives 8 pages, 8 pages.
Okay.
To those last 3 chapters.
Okay.
And yet the whole of the rest of it is 30 pages.
Yeah, right.
So,
yeah,
significant chunk.
Yeah.
Given over.
Yeah, and you don't often get to use the word literally in the right way, like when you say something literally is true. But here we are talking literally, as in words on a page, literal words on a page. It's worth paying attention to what Mark wants us to pay attention to. He literally wants us to care more about this chapter than, or at least to think more about the events of this chapter than the other ones. Yeah. I don't know if caring is quite the right word, but like he doesn't just zip through the final hours of Jesus.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, one of the central figures is Peter.
Yeah.
And of course, Peter is most likely to be behind.
Yeah, this is the kind of, there's some human elements here so Peter is the character behind this, probably. We don't know. Look, you know that we don't actually know, right? Like nowhere does it say.
No, I know, but we, as best as we can surmise,
it's a credible, put it this way, it's a credible theory.
Right.
It's not crazy and fantastic. It's credible, and you can locate Peter geographically in the right places at the right times to pass on this material. The character of Mark is associated with Peter in the book of Acts. The character of Mark has been associated with this gospel right back to very ancient times. So even though nowhere does it say, I, Mark, wrote these words thanks to Peter, big ups to Peter for all the good advice, he never says that.
I plagiarized Peter's letters.
The early church, right from the start, has associated this with Mark and Peter. Why would they do that unless there was good reason to think that it was association? So anyway, Peter is certainly a main character, and he's not, he's the main disciple, but he's not the best example of a disciple. But he's kind of an everyman, right? Like he's all of us.
Yeah, he is.
Because he's a screw up.
I find traveling through Easter week through the lens of Peter just a really helpful.
Yeah.
I know this is going to sound like a weird thing for someone like me to say, but the enormity of what Jesus went through,
right,
almost feels otherworldly. I kind of can't quite engage.
Right. Yeah.
But Peter, if you can engage through the lens of Peter, feels tangible. You kind of, yeah.
I think that's right. And isn't it funny how we have this idea of like modern writing or something is more sophisticated, but here is an ancient text, like really ancient. It's really hard to find a text that's more ancient than the Gospels.
Yeah.
In human history, let's be perfectly honest. There's a handful, but and yet it's very vivid, and the character of Peter really comes across, and there's some really interesting dialogue, and there's some humor, and he's relatable. Yeah. Absolutely. Like as a storyteller, Mark is very good. Like he's a good writer.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of it. I think that's part of what we've got. That's part of the gift. I don't think it does away with the gospel to point out that the editorial and creative hand was at work in the construction of this gospel. I don't think it diminishes it at all.
No.
Say, yeah, Peter he's being portrayed. Listen, I've written a biography of somebody before. I am literally a biographer. And it is possible to portray the raw figures of facts of somebody's life in different ways.
Yeah.
To make them have a certain character or not.
And how, out of interest, when you were writing that about Kierkegaard,
yeah.
was it hard to not slip into hagiography? You know, this kind of elevation of someone, make them almost other saint-like.
Well, yeah, if you wanted to make him saint-like, then you would just selectively choose not to put stuff in, or you'd write it in a certain way.
Yeah.
But I wasn't trying to make, I was aware that that's the problem. Like I was aware, oh yeah, hero worship is not actually a very useful guide to truth.
Yeah.
It doesn't really tell us something that we need to know. I'm going to be on guard against hero worship. And you can see that happen here in the gospel, right?
Mm.
And it's not that, and so it's either that Peter himself is bursting his own bubble. I think I mentioned before, it's like either Peter himself is bursting his celebrity bubble, or Mark, the biographer, is bursting the celebrity bubble. But either way, they are choosing not to portray Peter as the disciple who gets it right all the time, while at the same time they don't deny that Peter is the most important disciple.
Right. And I think it would be so easy to elevate Peter, given the role that he does have.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You know, at this point, he's the father of the church.
Yeah, that's why I think it's a deliberate puncturing of the celebrity bubble here. Yeah.
So interesting.
And I personally think that Peter was part of that. I think he went along with it.
Yeah.
But you know, and Mark is a gospel about discipleship as well. Like this is I don't know if we've talked about this for a while, but this was a major thing at the beginning of Mark, is that it is about following Jesus and being a disciple of Jesus.
Yeah.
And so his imagery of disciples is important.
Yeah.
There's just one of the funny ironic layers of Mark is that the disciples are almost never a good example of how to be a disciple.
Yeah.
But he thinks discipleship's really good.
So. Well, it wouldn't surprise me if Peter was part of the bubble bursting.
I know.
Because actually fundamentally his bubble was burst by Jesus. And what happened here on the events of Good Friday, on Maundy Thursday.
You just imagine this event of denying Jesus and then in the Gospel of John being reinstated, and that's pretty life-changing, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to go back to arrogant ways after that when you've been found wanting, and then even after you've been found wanting and you've been exposed, you've been then lifted up by the one that you let down.
And Peter,
you're not likely to go, you think, well, I'd rather live an honest life than one that is built on fraud.
Right. And this is like Peter becomes the target of, Jesus says, forgive your enemies. Jesus seeks to be reconciled. Like Peter becomes the enemy, that Jesus does all these things. The things that Jesus says you should do to your enemies, Jesus then does to Peter.
Wow.
You know, and that's really good. It's not like Jesus goes, oh, that was all theory. All that stuff about loving your enemies and seek to be reconciled, that was just theory. But Peter, you've screwed up.
And how much more important, indeed, that the person that needs to, if you like, lead the way in continuing the teaching of Jesus through the church is Peter, and he will have experienced the reality of living those things out at first hand. He was the one that experienced forgiveness. He was the one that experienced all those things.
Right.
Jesus challenges us to do, and so he then becomes the one who holds it and says, "It works. I've been on the receiving end. I was an enemy, and now." I mean,
don't you think that shines a new light on what we might mean when we say, "And on you, Peter, on this rock I'll build my church"? Like on your experience of failure and being forgiven, I will build my church. Yes,
that's helpful to think about.
So it's not like and you, Peter, the great superhero.
Yes.
The great celebrity charismatic leader who strides the stage in skinny jeans with a smoke machine behind you, or who writes all the books.
Yeah.
It's you screw up, whose mouth moves quicker than his brain. On you, I will build my church.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, we're going to get to Peter in a minute. Let's just quickly have a look at the woman with the alabaster jar.
Yep.
What are your thoughts about this?
Well, first of all, before we go straight into it, look at the beginning of verse 14, look at verse 2.
Chapter 14, verse 2.
Yeah, chapter 14. So the chief priests and the legal experts, the powerful figures,
Okay.
not just religious figures, but power figures, figures of
Yeah.
power.
Yeah.
They're looking for a way to kill Jesus, but they don't want it to happen during the festival. Otherwise, there would be an uproar amongst the people. So the people are, the oklos are this unruly crowd who sometimes really love Jesus and sometimes they don't, but
Yeah.
they're a force to be reckoned with. And the people of power are scared of the crowd. Okay. Then along comes this woman.
As is often the case, by the way.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, it happens.
The crowd.
It happens in politics and the church that the crowd shout louder.
Yeah, the politics doesn't really lead from the front; it leads from behind. And then Jesus he's with Simon, who has a skin disease or a leper, so he's unclean. So that's kind of significant. And then along comes a woman with perfume, and I think this is where I can't remember where this is the perfume. Oh yeah, it is. It's sold for a year's pay, or something like that. What does yours say in verse 5? How much is this worth? This perfume.
Verse 5. Did you say verse 5?
Yeah.
Well, in the NIV it says it could have been sold for more than a year's wages.
Right.
And in David Bentley Hart, 300 denarii.
Yeah.
And given to the destitute, they said.
Yeah. So it's kind of a significant amount, and I've heard in other places people talk about it like a inheritance. It was these jars of perfume you'd pass them on to your children when you died.
Okay, wow.
Like it was like that. It was like it was a treasure that you were supposed to pass on from generation to the next. And so she dumps it all out onto Jesus, and then someone scolds her. We find, a different, Mark doesn't tell us this, but other gospels say it was Judas the Iscariot.
Okay.
Mark doesn't tell us this. I don't know why.
Yeah, because Judas is there towards the end of this.
Exactly. And Mark is no fan of Judas, so either Mark didn't know this story, or for whatever reason he decides he doesn't need to put Judas in. But anyway, somebody scolds her. But I mean, just look at the politics here. We've already had the crowd who's really for Jesus, or the crowd that's really against the Pharisees, put it that way. We don't really know what the crowd thinks of Jesus. They don't always like him, but the Pharisees are scared of him anyway. And then you get somebody saying, oh, you should have spent all this money on the crowd. So there's and the other thing that this woman is doing, when she anoints, there are two types of people that get anointed in this Jewish culture. Do you know who they might be?
No, I don't know. I mean, I was going to guess. I would guess the religious people, and maybe the sick.
No, kings.
Okay.
So think of like Samuel anointing King David.
Yeah. Okay.
His oil over David, or pouring his oil over Saul.
Yeah.
You get anointed when you are a king, and then the other time you're anointed is when you're dead or about to die. You're prepared for death.
Okay.
So here comes a woman. She basically does two things. She get two birds with one stone.
She crowns him.
She declares Jesus the king.
Yeah.
And she prepares him for his death. She is a better disciple than Peter right now. Right? She gets it.
We don't get a name for her, interestingly.
We don't get a name. But we get the fact that she is a better disciple than Judas and Peter, because she recognizes the two things about Jesus. He said, I am the Son of Man. I am the one of great authority, and I'm going to suffer and die.
Yeah.
So we've got that kind of the crowd ranging around. We've got people worried about the power. We've got, oh, you should have given this money to keep the crowd happy. So there's like that element here of kingship and authority. And here she also is part of that. Jesus, there's an interesting feminist point that gets made. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza wrote a book called In Memory of Her. And she is a Roman Catholic feminist theologian. And she makes a really good point, a point that I agree with, where she says, look, it's not that Jesus was this kind of patriarch. Jesus was clearly a man who challenged the patriarchal ideas.
Yeah.
But the early church took a long time, if it ever has, of unweaning itself from some of these bad habits. And she sees in this story one of those examples, because here this woman comes, she dumps the oil out, she pronounces Jesus king, she pronounces that he's going to die. Some people try to scold her, and Jesus says, don't scold her, because people, I tell you the truth, wherever in the whole world this good news is announced, what she's done will be told in memory of her. And Elizabeth Schuster-Firenze says, well, isn't that interesting? Because we know Mark's name, we know Peter's name, we even know Judas Iscariot's name, but nobody bothered to mention her name. And this is her example. She's like, it's not Jesus who was being sexist right now. It's the system that's not deciding not to pass that name down. And we do get her name in other gospels, but she's associated with Mary in other gospels. But in Mark, for whatever reason, that bit of information didn't reach him.
Interesting.
And Firenze just says this is part of what we're dealing with when women trying to talk about the gospels, is that a lot of time their story and their contribution has been erased through, it's not because of Jesus, right? Yeah. So anyway, I wanted to mention that because that's a famous book in feminist theology. In memory of her. So anyway, that's part of that story.
Wow. Now this verse again is a verse that we've might have seen going around the houses a little bit. The poor you will always have with you.
Oh yeah, right.
Because I mean, I've heard some people, and I find myself vehemently disagreeing, use that as an excuse not to engage with any kind of social transformation ministry or any, because the poor will always have with us, what's the point? And I'm like, that surely cannot be how we read that verse.
Well, I know, because if I'm trying to find the exact verse here, I think it's Deuteronomy 15:1. In Deuteronomy 15, verses 1 to 11.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Right? Jesus is quoting the Hebrew scriptures here. And in the Hebrew scriptures, it says, the poor you will always have with you, therefore open your hand to the poor. Right? So it's not the poor you'll always have with you, therefore don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Do anything to help them. It's the poor you will always have with you, so you will always have someone to open your hand to. So that's, first of all, that's just worth pointing out.
Yeah.
So it's not a callous kind of thing.
It's not a dismissive, is it? It's not meant to be like, well, shrug your shoulders.
No, it's a hey, remember what the Deuteronomic vision is for the poor. And there's so much going on in the way Jesus deals with the poor and with money, and which the Acts church will really pick this up, because they will share everything they have with each other. And Acts tells us more than once that there was no poor amongst them. And this is part of the Deuteronomic vision, which is that when Israel is restored, there will be no poor amongst you.
Okay.
So in fact, you won't always have the poor with you in the restored Israel. So there is like that kind of vision. There's more going on here than just this one little verse that Jesus half alludes to. He's promoting a vision for within his own followers to have an attitude towards economic or money, or an attitude towards money which will actually do away with poverty.
Well, and also his point is that poor you always have with you, you won't always have me. And there's a sense in which what this woman is doing in her extravagant generosity, wasteful generosity almost, is what you should therefore do with the poor.
Yeah.
It's I always, I've been part of churches before where if they've ever asked for clothes donations, or they say, please don't give us your old rubbish that you're not going to, that's got holes in.
Yeah.
Actually instead go to the shops and buy a brand new jacket, not the one with the, to be extravagant. I know it's a silly example, but often we kind of think, oh, we'll get rid of the stuff I don't really want. Well, actually, according to this as a metaphor, Jesus is saying, no, you do the best. You give them the best. In that context,
Least honor we treat with the most honor in Corinthians.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of that attitude. I mean, the kinds of Christians that find in this verse their whole justification for completely ignoring social justice and financial justice, they don't want to be socially and economically just anyway. Like, they're just finding what they want in this verse, because you can't take the whole life of Jesus and the whole life of the early church and then just discard it based on half of this one verse. That's just absurd. Yeah. So, but yes, he's making not really a point even about poor people, to be honest. You're right. He's making more a point about, it's similar to the kind of point he made before when the Pharisee says to his disciples, why aren't you fasting? And Jesus says, well, you don't fast when the bridegroom is with them. They'll fast later. And it's a little bit like he's just saying, pay attention to what's happening right now. You're living in the moment right now when the Messiah is here, and there's going to be a time when he's not. Yeah.
And it's interesting then, having had the extravagance of Jesus being worshipped and someone essentially spending a significant amount of money on Jesus.
Yeah.
We then get the final verse of this little section where Judas betrays Jesus for a sum of money.
Yeah.
Those two are juxtaposed.
Oh, money is all over the place. Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
And they were delighted to hear that he would betray them and promise to give him money.
Yeah.
Well, then we get the Last Supper passage. Yeah,
there's a funny little window into the early Jesus movement here in verse 13 to 16, where Jesus has followers. Like, sometimes people treat this as if it's like this kind of miracle story of Jesus predicting that there'll be a person in another town and it will all miraculously happen. Mark, there's a lot of miracle stories in Mark. Like, we're not embarrassed by miracle stories. This isn't being portrayed as one of them. It's more Jesus has followers in towns that even the disciples don't know about.
Yeah.
It's more of an indication of how big the Jesus movement really is.
Right, absolutely. Well, and if we're to remember the Oikos that was gathering and hearing his teachings and experiencing the feeding of the 4,000 and 5,000.
Exactly. And remember that Jesus comes off the mountain and then his disciples say, hey, we found some people casting out demons in your name.
Oh, yeah.
There's clearly people doing stuff who recognize Jesus as Messiah or King, even if they're not part of the little core crowd.
Yeah.
And that's part of the story of Jesus. Yeah. So then we get the upper room.
Yeah.
What's your experience with communion and upper room stuff?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. So we've been on a fast from communion in COVID times. So, and I think what's interesting is that people really miss it as a remembrance of.
Right.
It's one of the few commands Jesus gives us to remember him by.
Yeah.
And I think we talked, I can't remember when we talked about it, but eating together is a great leveler, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I find that when I receive communion, I get a bit of bread and a bit of wine just as much as anybody else.
Right.
And we're all the same, and we're coming to the Lord's table. It's not my table as the priest, it's the Lord's table. It's his. And and to have something physical as well, to remember that which is spiritual, whatever your views of transubstantiation or consubstantiation or whatever you believe is happening there, or whether it's just symbolic or
it's still
the reality is you've been given something physical to remember that which is spiritual.
Yeah, and I mean, there's even a bit of his church historical stuff going on here. Like, Catholic high liturgical theologians will get excited by these passages because they'll say, look, actually this Mark's language seems to have slipped into liturgy language. Because we have early Christian liturgies of communion. There's this book called the Didache, which is It's a really ancient Christian book. It was written before some parts of the New Testament were written. That's how old it is. But it's not considered to be part of the gospel or part of the canon, but it's as old as the New Testament. And there's a pretty fully formed Eucharist liturgy inside that already. So within like living memory of Jesus, people had a liturgy of the communion.
Yeah.
And so people who read this here in Mark are kind of excited because it's actually it's not that Mark is inventing the liturgy. It's more likely that he's quoting something people already knew.
Okay.
So Jesus is now like using the language in Mark's gospel. Jesus is using the language that they've already been practicing as a church. So it's this idea that the Eucharistic supper is a really ancient practice.
Yeah.
It predates even the Gospel of Mark, right?
Well, and if my memory serves me right, it's 1 Corinthians 12, I believe, 10 rather, that the rooted of that liturgy is there.
Yeah, which is again a book that predates Mark.
Yeah.
And it came from Jesus. I'm not saying that it didn't come from Jesus, but I'm saying is like Mark seems to be actually shifting the tone. Like he seems to shift the language, and he puts into Jesus's mouth the kind of language they would have already been familiar with.
Yeah. I remember studying this in great detail along with the Corinthians passage. And when I say great detail, a lot of debate about what Jesus meant by is.
Oh, right.
Is.
This is my body.
This is my body. Is he saying is in a symbolic, and you could go around in circles.
No, I just don't even get into that.
Those who want to take a kind of transubstantiation line will say, yes, that's is. He literally means is. It's going to turn into the body and blood of Jesus as you are consuming it. And those that say, well, no, surely it's in the same way, and
I don't even have anything to add to that hasn't been said for.
No, well, exactly. I mean, that's so, this. But what's interesting as well, I find this is that this is the only time that they partake in a Eucharistic meal. I know there's echoes of it in the feeding.
Yeah, right.
He talks about does he lifts it aloft and he does things like that, which
another example,
is liturgical within Mark. But in terms of something that is so core to the Christian identity in the church now, for Catholics, this is central. For those within the Anglo-Catholic tradition, in the Anglican Church, this is central.
Yeah.
And then there are those that say actually it's so special that we shouldn't take communion more than 4 times a year, 5 times a year. Why are we taking it every week?
Yeah.
So it's just very interesting that side of things. And then we move into Peter's denial, which of course is which had been predicted by Jesus.
Yeah.
Well, no, sorry. Here we have the prediction, and then later on we'll have the denial. But he predicts them, and of course Peter, in his bold way, says, "No, even if all fall away, I won't do that." And Jesus is very specific before the rooster crows twice.
Right. Again, obviously such an old story, like that you wouldn't make up. It just has that real ring of kind of, Mark is telling the old hits. He's telling the story that's already well known to this community because somebody like Peter has been telling them this for years.
And again, if you were writing hagiography, you would dial down some of this. You might, why would you add in, even if I have to die for you, I will never disown you. Why would you add that in? You could easily kind of make reference to the story, but dial down the kind of Peter's failure on this. But Mark doesn't do that.
And it's also, it's a bit like we were talking about last time with the pressure for people to prove their allegiance to their homeland. In Mark, there is a kind of a tamping down of certain enthusiasms where people are being tempted to sort of run wild with their own enthusiastic declarations of allegiance and stuff. And they are portrayed as slightly negative or foolish in the Gospel of Mark. And here's another one. And it's a little bit like, I don't really care what you say. I care what you do. Right? I don't care that you say you'll follow me. What I care is if you actually follow me. And that comes out in some of these as well. And again, you remember, like, Jesus, the quality of followers is important in Mark.
Yeah. Okay.
And that being a follower doesn't just mean declaring Lord, Lord. It means actually following Lord, Lord.
Yeah.
And so we see that a lot. And this would be another example, I think. So where do you want to talk next? He goes into
I mean, Gethsemane for me is the passage that demonstrates the humanity of Jesus.
Yeah, right.
You know, you don't get, you know, the miracle maker Jesus here. You get the,
you
know, distressed, desperate, you know, almost ready to relinquish his purpose on earth at this point.
Right. Yeah. Please release me from this, but not my will, but yours be done. Yeah. I mean, John it's interesting to look at how different gospels will put in different, more detail and things, but it's always the same story. There's always this Gethsemane. There's always Jesus in anguish. There's always the betrayal.
Yeah. I mean, and it's, you know, even just the intimacy of even this moment of distress, you know, you rarely in the gospels, you rarely are exposed to the exact words of the prayer.
Right.
You know that Jesus went off and prayed.
Yeah, right.
But here we are exposed to the kind of prayer it is.
Yeah.
The words uttered, and you get the intimacy, you know, Abba, Father, everything is possible for you. Take this cup, yet not what I will, but you will. You know, you've got that.
Again, it's such an interesting aspect that, again, you feel like, why would you make that up if you were trying to invent a triumphalistic religion? Why would you invent Jesus in anguish saying, I don't want to do this? Except that it is an example of discipleship. It is an example of submission and obedience.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So, John will tell us that the garden is where Jesus often went with his disciples, and so that makes Judas's betrayal all the more, you know, a punch to the heart, because he's like, oh, I know where Jesus is, because he always went there with us. It was our special friend, where we were all friends together, that kind of thing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So it's like the betrayal is right at the heart of the friendship. Well,
and I think we often forget as well that Mark's gospel, because of its pace, and I know we talked about this chapter and the previous chapter, and the chapters to come, slowing down.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we notice about Mark is the element of journey that happens, you know, from place to the place is really important.
Yes.
And it's important for all of us. You know, we go back to our old roots of growing up, and immediately they're evocative. You know, we go back to a place, oh, you know, this is where this happened, or this, and immediately you're taken back to. And I think this is what we see here is that if indeed, you know, we include John's gospel in the middle of that this is a place that they called home, and a place of intimacy, not just for Jesus and God the Father, but for them all.
Yeah. And the not my will but yours be done is a very honest type prayer that I think believers are always having to pray. So there's something very core about this story.
And then you've got the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak. You know, they're falling asleep. You know, these are hardened fishermen. They knew what it was to work through the night.
Yeah.
They knew how to not have much sleep. They knew how to do that.
Well, again, and he keeps telling them, like, be on guard. Like, he's told them this before, like, watch out. This is a phrase he often uses.
We had it at the end of chapter 13, be vigilant.
Be vigilant, and now they're not. They're asleep, and it's just this part of the story of the disciples.
Yeah.
And so and then he ends with the human one again. He calls himself the Son of Man, the Daniel figure who's going to be betrayed.
Interestingly, he refers to Peter as Simon here.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And I often think when he's trying to do that, I think he does it in the, I could be wrong, but I've got a feeling he does it in John chapter 21 in Peter's restoration, that he refers to Peter as Simon, son of, I've got a feeling that's true.
Yeah.
Anyway, I do think it's about re-establishing, because of course it was Jesus that renamed Peter Peter, and he renamed Peter because he's the rock on which the church will be built.
Yeah.
And yet here he's saying Simon. It's almost as Simon has reverted, he's forgotten his calling.
Yeah.
And Jesus is saying, are you asleep? I mean, I forgot even that Peter was the one that was asleep. Not, he wasn't the only one, but he was one of the ones that was asleep.
Yeah.
He's having a bad old time of it, Peter, in this, you know. But it's in Jesus says, Simon, he says to Peter, are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Simon.
So we're going to wrap up this chapter. But before we do, we have the arrest of Jesus.
Yeah.
We talked about this actually in the last episode, so if you haven't caught it up yet, but this desire for Jesus to not turn to violence, even when violence is coming towards him.
Yeah.
And Jesus is arrested and betrayed by a kiss. We don't know who, but one of those standing near drew a sword, struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear.
Yeah. There's always somebody who draws a sword. There's always a servant that gets hurt, and it looks like it was an intent to kill. It wasn't. You don't try to cut off somebody's ear. You're trying to cut.
No, I mean that's very precise.
Yeah, and Jesus says no. And in Luke, he says right before this story, Jesus says, "I want you to go buy a sword so that you'll look like an outlaw." In Luke 22, it says a lot of people who love their weapons and their guns, they go, "Oh, Jesus said buy a weapon. That's great." But then, like, immediately he tells them not to use it.
Yeah.
And this story shows up. And also, it's really important to notice that he says, so that you'll be counted amongst the outlaws. Jesus tells you exactly why he wants his disciples to buy a sword. And it's a reference to an Old Testament verse. But notice that the word outlaw shows up here as well. Because he says, what am I? Am I an outlaw? And the word outlaw here is leistes, which is the Galilean highwaymen. Do you remember I mentioned them before?
Yeah.
They're the kind of ones that were like associated with living on the margins. They're not powerful people.
Okay.
But they had a kind of a Robin Hood type cachet about them.
Okay.
And so they were kind of folk heroes, but obviously the people in power didn't like them or trust them, but the kind of hard scrabble poor people like them.
Yeah. Okay.
One of the things leistes did, or these outlaws did, is they robbed the roads, the Roman roads. So they made the roads unsafe. But when you rob Roman roads, you're basically just robbing from the rich. To give
yeah. Okay.
And it was a leistes that was on either side of Jesus at the cross. He's going to be associated with these outlaws even at the cross.
Yeah. Okay.
And there's always this idea that, oh, are you associated? Like he says to the disciples, you need to buy a sword because people are going to think that you are these outlaws.
Yeah. You
are going to be people who live on the margins of power, who are seen to be enemies of Rome, seen to be enemies of the elite. That's who you look like. That's what you're like.
Yeah.
It's not buying a sword doesn't mean it's not about like being really powerful with your weapons. In a way, it's almost the opposite. It's like you don't have any because you don't have any systems of society to support you. Like people who buy swords are the ones who can't rely on the army to support them.
Okay.
Or hired security guards to support them. They're not elite. They're not powerful. But he's essentially saying, look like somebody who's not elite and powerful.
Okay.
And then here he's in the garden and Jesus says, do you think I'm one of these people? I guess you think I'm one of these people. You must think I'm an outlaw who's going to lead some kind of revolution from the margins and take over the places of power. But that's not what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the mysterious young man. Some people think that might be Mark putting himself in the story, but we don't.
Yeah.
We honestly don't know.
Yeah. Okay.
And then he's taken to before the Sanhedrin. And if you remember in the last chapter, he talked about you're going to be taken before governors and priests. Well, now Jesus is taken before that.
Yeah. So tell me, because it seems to me that Jesus has to be in terms of the way that the legal construct worked, he had to be trialed by the Jewish law first, right, before the Romans would do anything about it.
Yeah, and it's not a legitimate court. So the idea here is that these aren't legitimate courts. They're more like kangaroo. You know the phrase kangaroo court?
Oh, I do. Yes, I do.
So it's a little bit like that. It's like they're kind of going through the motions of looking like they did it all correctly, but actually they're convening at the wrong times of day and night. The wrong kinds of people are there.
It's a stitch up.
It's a stitch up. Yeah, it's part of the corruption. It's part of the indictment of the system, which claims to be about rule of law and peace. So the Pharisees and the Romans and the priests all claim to be like agents of order and peace.
Yeah.
And Mark and all the gospel writers are like, you had one job, priests and Pharisees and Pilate. You had one job to keep the peace, and you couldn't even abide by your own rules. You're so bad at keeping the peace, you can't even abide by your own laws.
Yeah.
Let alone the laws of Jesus and the kingdom.
And it's, it's interesting. He's been betrayed by his friends.
Yeah.
He's been abandoned in the form of Peter, denied, or will do in a moment, by his friends. He subject to a false court, didn't really, like you said, there's no legitimacy to it.
Yeah.
People then testify falsely, so he's lied about.
Yeah.
Their statements are contradictory. And then they, of course, misquote him by saying, I will destroy this temple with you, in 3 days I'll build another.
Yeah. But note that some sort of challenge to the temple is the charge that sticks with Jesus all the way through.
So that's the crux of their anger, is it?
Yeah. And we've already been talking about how so often a lot of his teaching and some of the points he's scoring against the priests and the Pharisees is actually connected to the destruction of the temple.
Well, and the fulfillment.
Yeah.
That he supersedes it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So Jesus is silent, doesn't give any answer.
Yeah. Again, very interesting element of the Jesus story. And then he's condemned. The crowd starts to turn against him. And then Peter also turns against him, right? Out of fear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the only thing we have condemned him worthy of death is his, when he's asked a direct question, a yes or no question. Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? And he says, I am.
Yeah,
it's the only thing he admits to being guilty of.
Yeah.
It's interesting. He doesn't, it's a good point, actually, because we often say Jesus was, killed unnecessarily and albeit unjust system and process. Absolutely, all those things are true.
Yeah.
But again, he doesn't perjure himself. He doesn't lie. He doesn't, for the sake of knowing that he's got to fulfill this mission given to him by his Father, he doesn't kind of say, oh yeah, I'm guilty of everything you say. He stays silent until the very moment that he can say this is true.
And of course, the whole theme of the messianic secret is appropriate here, that Jesus has always been telling people to shut up and to not talk about it. And he's always been like not directly affirming some of their charges about being the Messiah. And now he says he is.
Yeah.
Because the Son of Man must suffer and die, right? The messianic secret is you think the Messiah is all about power and victory. Actually, it's about suffering and dying. And now here's Jesus. He's bound in chains. He's got soldiers around him. He's going to die. And he says, yeah, I am. Because the time is now right to reveal who he really is.
Yeah.
And
so then they condemn him. He starts to beat him. They blindfold him.
Yeah.
Prophesy, as in, guess who hit me? Guess who hit you, rather?
I guess, yeah.
Come on, who hit me? Who hit you? Come on,
so
we blindfolded you.
This is the low point that we're going to leave at, which is a very good point to be left at this time of the Holy Year, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Jesus is then disowned by Peter.
And Peter breaks down sobbing, verse 72.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he knows, because the cockerel crows 3 times.
Yeah.
And on the third, Sorry, crows twice, but disowned 3 times.
Yeah.
That, I think, is the Kairos moment for Peter. That moment.
Yeah, good point.
That's the bit that I think he no longer had a proud bone in his body that was about his own
Right.
self-aggrandizement. It was about.
Yeah.
Well, let's just have a moment of quiet on Maundy Thursday, having read that, and then we'll sign off today's episode. So we thank you, Lord, for what we've just read. Help us. Amen. Thanks, Stephen. A whistle-stop tour through the days before Jesus, or the day before Jesus.
Hey, right?
Yeah, right. One day.
Well, very good. It's not the end of the story, so we'll pick this up. The end of the story is coming, so we'll get to the end when we next meet.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Go well.